Welcome everyone and good morning. This is Bat Week and Vermont Coverts is really excited and happy to host Alyssa Bennett, who is the small mammals biologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, to talk to us about our bat species here in Vermont and what we as landowners can do to look at improving habitat to help these species. There's a lot of issues facing bats: fragmentation, loss of habitat, white nose syndrome. So we're going to learn about that today. And I'm really excited, and I'll turn it over to Alyssa in just a moment. And just some housekeeping. If everybody would keep themselves muted, and so we don't have the background noise. And then also, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat box, and I'll facilitate at the end and relay those questions to Alyssa so she can answer those as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa, and let's hear about bats.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Excellent. Okay, I saw a nod. That's good. Yeah. Great. So thank you again for joining us. Happy Bat Week. It's very exciting. If you have people in your life who are excited about Halloween, you'll notice that it does correspond with Halloween at the end of the week. So it's a good way of bringing people's attention off of all the things that they believe are scary about bats and focusing them on things that are positive about bats and ways that we can work together, do some habitat management centered around bats for this presentation. But also, if you have any questions at the end, general questions about bats, feel free to ask. I'm going to touch on a little bit of their biology so that you'll have a basis for understanding how to think like a bat and manage your forest for bats. And I'll also be touching a little bit on the major threat to our cave bat species, which is white nose syndrome. But again, all these things I can go into far more detail about, so just think about what questions you have, and at the end I will leave plenty of time to get to those. If you look at this first slide here, you can see a bat tucked up under bark, and you'll also see an arm band. Unlike birds, with bats we need to put a band on their forearm because the bats that we have around here, their skin that's between their legs and their tail actually goes all the way down to their ankles, so there's no room to put a band down there. But this allows us, if we recapture bats, to understand things about them, such as the fact that bats can live to be 30 to 40 years old, which is pretty incredible. And if you can make it out, there's actually a tiny little wire coming off of this bat's back because we have a radio transmitter on it in this case. So this is just showing you how bats, most of our species, are about the size of your thumb or a man's thumb, their body size. So they love to squeeze right up into spaces. And here we have a classic example of a bat utilizing this exfoliating bark here on a tree that's declining. So we can see a lot of value in those parts of our habitat. I work for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and our mission is about the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitat for the people of Vermont. So as my brother-in-law likes to say, and I'm not sure why the slides are advancing on their own. I haven't presented in Zoom before, so I apologize if it takes me a minute. As my brother-in-law likes to say, so ipso facto, you work for me. So yes, I work for all the people of Vermont, and this is really to help bring some awareness to some of the things that you can do in your own backyards. Bats are pretty incredible because they are very voracious insect eaters, and they're the primary forager on insects at night because bats are nocturnal. All of the bat species that we have in Vermont forage on insects, and in fact, they can eat quite a lot. A lactating female, when she's raising her pup, can eat an entire, up to her entire weight in insects every night, and most bats are eating about half their weight in insects at night during the summer. That adds up to a lot. And if you try to picture what it would be like if you ate that much every day to sustain yourself, here's an example. But you wouldn't feel guilty because you're flying, you're burning lots of calories, and in the wildlife world, it can be great to be fat. So you want to pack on those calories during the short period of time when we have lots of insect availability and activity in the spring, summer, and fall, because then bats need to make it through our long winters. This is a pretty beneficial thing because bats are eating a variety of different insects that can be forest pests, agricultural pests, and even pests to humans, such as mosquitoes, moths that give rise to the corn boring worms. And I've even read that big brown bats have been found to eat emerald ash borers. Not something that we've seen yet here in Vermont, but as we're using advanced tools to look at the molecular contents of bat droppings, we're better understanding the exact species of insects that bats are eating rather than just groups such as moths, butterflies, true flies. We can actually get down to the species level now with these tools, which is very exciting. And in fact, it's been said that bats may become an early detection tool for understanding invasive insect species before we maybe see them on the landscape. Bats have unique ways of capturing insects. Most of us think of them as hawkers, which means they're flying through the air and snatching insects out of the air as they forage. That might be in a big group of insects when there's a hatch out, or they might be pursuing a single insect, but they also can be gleaners. And we do have some species such as the northern long-eared bat that specialize in gleaning insects off of trees. So they're actually using passive listening in addition to their echolocation. Bats amazingly also can tell the difference in texture between the tree bark and the back of an insect, for example. They have incredible discrimination with their echolocation, and they are able also to see. Bats are not blind. So they're using those skills, and we've found spiders in their diets, as well as other things like aphids and insects that might be on trees and not flying. Amazingly, a colony of about 150 female bats can consume as many as 90,000 insects in one night. So again, we're talking about huge biomass here that really adds up. And in fact, calculations about how bats contribute to the agricultural industry in the United States have shown that that adds up to anywhere from $3 to $53 billion per year that we're saving the agricultural industry in terms of what they would have to apply in pesticides to deal with insects that are damaging to crops. And now it's time to start thinking like a bat. So with some basic biology and understanding of where bats fit into our ecosystem, it's exciting to see the forest a little more from their perspective. The best way for you to understand how to manage your forest is to really think about what a bat would need. And not unlike you, they like to have a dry, warm place that they can hang out. Bats do not nest. They're not gathering any materials. They're not building anything. They're not chewing or digging. They are just incredible opportunists that are looking for spaces where they can find that dry, warm home that they can hang out during the day. And in this case, we have a few examples here of some, on the left, a live shagbark hickory, and on the right, we have what we would call a snag or a dead tree. And both of these are examples where there is what we would call peeling or exfoliating bark, and the tree on the right also may have some cavities on the other side. So these are creating dry spaces for bats. What they're looking for are these specific features. So in that case, it doesn't necessarily matter what species of tree you have here, just that it has the features bats are looking for. And not every bat is looking for the same exact features. So we'll talk about that. In terms of the broader landscape, bats also forage along the edges of forested areas, over water, either under or above the canopy, depending on the species. So we have forest edge pictures here along open water bodies, wetlands, fields. You have riparian zones or areas along rivers and waterways. And then bats also will take advantage of places where they have protection from aerial predators, their largest or most significant predator being owls in this case. And they will forage along skid trails and haul roads, and they'll use those as little travel corridors to commute between their roosting places and their main foraging places, or places they go to get water. And they'll use those as protection. So they like to be either on the edge or under closed canopy for our smaller species, so they're protected, whereas some of the larger species actually are foraging over the treetops. When we think about these species that get together in groups in what we call colonies, those bats are often getting together and roosting in spaces where you may find upwards of 100 bats just in a single tree in this example. On the left here, we see some peeling bark and what we would call a crack or crevice in the tree. And we have Indiana bats that love to roost under peeling bark, and northern long-eared bats would love to just squeeze in like sardines into that crevice there. And on the right is a roost tree where we've tracked Indiana bats both in the spring. I believe we counted up to 65 bats in there in that tree in the spring, and we counted over 80 bats there during the summer when we found bats roosting there in the summer. And again, this is what it looks like if you were able to peek up under there and see what's going on. You can see that they love to just squeeze into those spaces. Some of the other things we know about bats are that they used to be everywhere, or at least that's what it seemed like before 2006, when the disease white nose syndrome was discovered. So here is a pretty cool picture of bats that are swarming. The life cycle of bats is that in the fall, they get together at these areas around caves and mines for our 6 hibernating species. And the males and females meet up there and they will mate at that site. And then they will actually stay for the winter and store the sperm over the winter and ovulate in the spring for a delayed fertilization. And then they raise their pups in the summer and start that cycle all over again, coming back in the fall. So this was a large gathering of little brown bats, and we get a good picture of them in the air here doing some of their incredible acrobatics. But that's not exactly what things look like anymore. The disease white nose syndrome came along and was first discovered. This was one of the classic pictures taken in New York State in 2006 when no one had any idea what this was. The powdery substance on the nose of these bats is the fungus that causes this disease. It loves to live in cool, wet places, which is exactly where bats hibernate, and it tends to grow right in the temperature range, which is ideal for the hibernation of some of these species, such as little brown, northern long-eared, tricolored, and Indiana bats. And unfortunately, it sets into their skin and can be quite damaging. So for the first few years, no one understood what this was until we started to see mass die-off. What we found with the bats individually was any exposed skin was a place for that fungus to set up shop. And this is not a normal looking bat wing. This wing is infected with the fungus, and it grows these long hyphae, which tend to create these cupping erosions, which just literally eats away at the bat skin. And bats in the spring then come out, they're totally emaciated because they've been arousing out of hibernation too frequently in the winter. Sometimes they just fly out on the landscape to die, or might just die right in their roost. But in most cases, what we found is they fly out onto the landscape and they die. And so that meant we didn't see as many dead bats as we just saw the numbers completely disappear at some of these sites. So here are a number of the caves and mines where we know that bats hibernate in Vermont. As you can see on the left with the total number of bats, most of our sites are not very large. A lot of these sites that we have good long-term data for are smaller caves and mines. But you can see that when you come to 2009, 2010, we have this dramatic drop in the population. So as we go across time on the bottom there in the year of the survey, you can see that those numbers just crashed around that point and bats disappeared. And some of those sites, as you can see, completely zeroed out and we have no bats left. So we saw about a 90% decline at many of our sites due to white nose syndrome. Even at some of our larger sites, some of those are dangerous mines we weren't able to go into safely and have never had good counts at. But when we trapped bats outside the entrance, we could find that those sites that used to have tens of thousands of bats had also declined dramatically. Our largest site, amazingly, which used to have several 100,000 bats, still our population estimate from 2016 was that we do still have 70 to 90,000 bats there. So we have one stronghold here for all of New England, really. Because of this disease, it meant that we actually added 3 species to the Vermont State Endangered Species List. Those are circled in green, the northern long-eared, little brown, and tricolored bat. The northern long-eared bat later was also listed as federally threatened. At this point, that bat is undergoing a status review, and that listing may in fact change to endangered because white nose syndrome has spread throughout almost its entire range at this point and has had a similar effect on the bat where over 90% of that species has declined due to the disease. In Vermont, we estimate somewhere around 98 to 99% of those bats disappeared. The Indiana bat has been listed as federally and state endangered since the 1960s, circled in red. The eastern small-footed bat has always been very rare in Vermont and across most of its range, and it's listed as state threatened. Those two species, amazingly, because they seem to hibernate in areas that are cooler and drier where the fungus doesn't grow as well, and maybe due to some other adaptations like how they move around in the winter, did not initially suffer as great declines, but the Indiana bat unfortunately is catching up. And the big brown bat, because it hibernates in people's homes over the winter, also seems to have escaped some of the effects of this disease and may be doing well. Over on the right, you can see we have 3 other species, and you'll notice none of them are circled. Those are what we call our migratory tree bat species. Very beautiful, unlike our smallish brownish bats on the left, which all look very similar. These species migrate south for the winter. They do not hibernate over winter, and they're often much more unique looking with beautiful bright colors in the case of the red bat or the orange face of the hoary bat. These are bats that are mostly solitary roosters, and they tend to roost in the foliage with the exception of the silver-haired bat, which also uses cavities and bark. And that means that people do not see them very often. They don't go into homes to roost, and they don't gather in large groups. So they're much more rare for people to ever have an encounter with, but they are out there. And if you are lucky enough, perhaps you will walk through the forest and see a red bat hanging in a tree and be able to distinguish it from the other leaves that are hanging on the tree. White nose syndrome, where is it now? This is the latest spread map I could find. I think that no one's had a chance to make an updated map for 2020, but as you can see here, the colors are coding for different years. You can find a little red circle in New York State where the fungus was first discovered, and then it quickly spread. And what you'll notice about the spread is it moved right down the Appalachian Mountains. And that's where a lot of our cave and karst is, where bats hibernate in the winter. And what you'll see by these colors is not only a trend over the years leading to red being the most recent counties that are termed positive in this map, but you can also notice here that not everything is highlighted. So if you were to look at the state of Vermont, most of the counties are highlighted, but not all of them. And that's because this map, which was created by the USGS, is based on dead and bats or samples that were sent into the USGS health lab. And we have a positive identification of the disease. In fact, we have noticed the signs of this disease at all of our caves and mines, even though we didn't send samples in to be tested. And that's really true across the East here. So we know that the disease is now confirmed in 13 different bat species in 35 states, so over half the US, and 7 Canadian provinces. And the fungus that causes the disease, which now that we're looking for that and for earlier signs, will show up in a site before we see the massive declines in bats dying, perhaps a few years before. That's been confirmed on 5 additional species, some of which may not be suffering declines, but could in fact carry that fungus longer distances, and in 6 additional states. And what you don't see on the map here is Montana actually now also has positive confirmation of the fungus, which would show up. And let's see, Washington State was an area where we saw a big jump a few years ago, and it looks like there was maybe an accidental transport of a bat to that area because bats aren't usually flying across the Rockies there. In terms of understanding where we are now and what's been happening for the last decade and a half almost, if you look on the left, you'll see in that yellow square the arrows for each bat. And if you look at the arrow in the space that it fills vertically is an approximate estimate of the percentage declines that a bat suffered from white nose syndrome. So big brown bats initially were thought to have declined by about 35% from the disease, looking at our population monitoring mostly from winter surveys where we count bats underground. Whereas the northern long-eared bat, you can see that that arrow fills almost the entire vertical space of the picture there, because northern long-eared bats declined by approximately 95 to 99%. And as you can see, the tricolored and little brown bats also around 90%. But when we look over and the green square on the right, this is what we think our current population trends are. These are a lot more difficult to understand because once a species is incredibly rare, it becomes very difficult to get a population trend on them. If you see 3 bats in the site one year and 2 the next year and then 3 the next year, it's hard to tell what's going on when the numbers are so small. And in some cases, now that we're using our summer data from acoustics and captures, these bats again are so rare that it's very difficult for us to detect a trend. But what we do seem to get from reports from people are that big brown bats in the top left corner seem to be doing well. And in some cases, we believe that their colony sizes may be going up. And in fact, we're capturing them in locations we didn't before, suggesting that they may be moving into open niches where other bat species have disappeared. The eastern small-footed bat in the top right there, it's possible that they are increasing, but they've always been so rare. Again, it's hard for us to get a trend. And then when we look at the other species on the bottom there, we do have concerns about Indianas and northern long-eared bats is continuing to decline. Tricolored bats are so rare, it's hard to tell. Little brown bats, it appears based on our pretty intensive summer monitoring efforts where these bats gather in buildings and we're able to count them coming out with the help of volunteers, that those numbers are stable. So that's very exciting for a species that declined by about 90% and is one we're very familiar with because it lives in buildings. We're excited to see that they really seem to be holding steady at about 10% of their population. So that's really the update on the front of white nose syndrome and populations for those cave bat species. Now let's go back to habitat. So why is habitat important and what kind of habitat is important for bats? Well, there are 2 main types of habitat we're thinking about for these threatened and endangered hibernating species. One is their maternity colony habitat. So that's literally where the females gather in the summer to roost and raise their young. So they need roost trees in some cases, or for eastern small-footed bats who like rocky areas, that would be talus, cliffs, quarries. They also need foraging habitat and they need travel corridors. And usually those different elements that a bat is using in the summer are all within a few miles. So we think of that as their home range. For Indiana bats, we have the best information, and 2.5 to 3 miles is about the size of the area that all of those elements occur within. Hibernacula habitat, or places that these bats hibernate, is the other type of habitat that's really important and limiting for these species. So if you happen to be a private landowner who has a cave or a mine on your land, then we try to work proactively with you because nearly all of our caves and mines where bats are known to hibernate are on private land. So the future of these species really does depend on some careful management there, especially right around the entrance, trying to make sure that the airflow and temperature inside that site is maintained by not altering the vegetation around the entrance. But then bats, when they're gathering together in that fall swarm, like we saw with all the bats in the air in the beginning, they need to have some roosting habitat close by so they don't waste a lot of energy getting out to places to roost. And they need some connectivity to make sure that they can make it between their summer and their winter homes. So that's important in terms of forest connectivity. Amazingly, we have 9 different species of bats and they tend to use the habitat differently. This is the best picture I can find to explain this, although these are not the exact species we have in Vermont. But what you'll see here is that you have bats that are foraging in all sorts of different ways. You have some bats that are foraging above the canopy. You have some bats that are foraging under the canopy, some that are foraging literally around and among the trees. And they're using different types of echolocation, whether that's frequency modulated calls, where you'll see a big change in the frequency over time. They'll have different, what's the word I'm looking for? Stumbling over words. Bats will call at different frequencies. So you'll have larger bat species that have almost what we would call a deeper voice, almost within the range of very young humans. We can hear up to 10 to 20 kilohertz, but most of our smaller bat species are calling up in the 40 to 100 kilohertz range. And so that's well outside of our hearing range and what we call the ultrasonic. But that allows them to target different species and forage in different habitat types. So that also means that there are a lot of different types of conservation practices that are very compatible to that habitat conservation, because those practices also do things to create edge, for example, or young forest, which brings in a lot of insect matter for bats to be able to forage on. There might be forest bird initiatives or things that protect nesting birds in the summer, which means not cutting trees when bats also would be roosting in them and could be vulnerable. So we find that forest management and managing habitat for bats are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Some of the management practices that we really focus on for bats are retaining certain elements. And those elements can include mature trees. What we see for Indiana bats, if you're in the Champlain Valley where that species lives, is that they do tend to gather and roost in the larger trees. So trees with a diameter at breast height of 18 inches or greater are much more likely to be their primary roost. Whereas some of the other species are a lot less picky about size or age class, but they just want something with a cavity, live, dead, or dying. Cavity trees are on there. Trees with exfoliating bark, again, dead or alive. And riparian buffers are very important. Bats, just like all wildlife, need fresh water, not just for foraging, but also so they can drink. They literally dip down and drink in that fresh water, in open water. But they need protection from aerial predators when they're foraging in those areas. Creating edge also can be excellent because bats are sometimes really adapted to foraging along those edges, such as Indiana bats, who seem well suited to be in the Champlain Valley here. And maintaining uneven age stands. So that means that what you're doing is you're allowing for different trees to mature at different rates and for bats to have an ongoing supply of roosting potential, and also with some of those young forest initiatives to create small patches and areas where there's new growth that's attracting a lot of insect matter for foraging. These long-range management plans that landowners develop are important for thinking about how to maintain those elements as you're doing forest management over time. And avoiding take is really a big one. So when we think about habitat, we're thinking about not only what to maintain and to create, but we're thinking about when bats are really concentrated and most vulnerable on the landscape to some type of forest management activity. And focusing tree cutting in an area where you know you have bats in the woods, or especially in an area like the Champlain Valley, where we have several endangered species, which are pretty highly concentrated in raising their young, and you could have upwards of 100 bats roosting in a tree at one time, then that's where you want to focus that cutting on the winter time. So November through March, because bats are underground at that time and they're not concentrated in trees. So that would be the best time to avoid take. Another thing that we want to focus on is thinking about spreading patch cuts out. This helps us to avoid removing all of a colony's potential roosts at one time. And I'll show you a picture that helps to explain that. And retaining potential roost trees. And I'll give you some examples on how to do that. This picture here actually is my father. He was a logger growing up, originally started with horses, skidding trees out of the woods, and then eventually moved on to the skidders. But that's sort of the picture of what I grew up with there. Retaining potential roost trees. Now let's get a picture in our mind again of what it is bats are looking for. So you want to try to keep a diversity or a selection of trees in your woods that have cavities, cracks, peeling bark. Those could be in live, dead, or dying trees. But you want to make sure that you're not leaving that snag that you think is going to be great for bats out in the middle of a patch cut, because bats will not want to fly there. They do not want to roost in an isolated tree because it is very dangerous for most of these small species to fly across an open space. So you want to maintain those within or along the edge of forested stands or in groups with other potential roost trees, so that bats will have a selection. To get an idea of what those look like, here are a few examples. Sometimes bats are using cavities that have been excavated by woodpeckers on the right there. Might be holes that have been used or abandoned by other animals, Or in other cases, it's where a branch split off and a hole rotted into the tree. But what we're looking for is a hole that goes into the bole of the tree. They may be using crevices, such as the northern long-eared bat, sometimes big brown bats as well, squeezing into these vertical crevices. As long as it looks like there's a waterproof space in there, that's what bats are looking for. And under exfoliating bark, shagbark hickories in the Champlain Valley are famous for having these giant pieces of peeling bark. When you think of peeling bark though, bats again are looking for a roof and a dry space. So you want it to be peeling in a roof-like pattern. If you have a very mature white birch or cherry, you might find a large enough piece of peeling bark or one peeling in this fashion, but it's also possible that many cherries just have bark that's too small in the flakes, and that most white birches likely will have bark that's peeling in a horizontal fashion. So looking at the individual tree. And then you can have some of this, what people call wolf pine or field pine, old white pines, and that bark tends to peel off in really large chunks. Dead elms and dead ash are also trees that tend to peel off in these large chunks. And then sometimes they can open up the canopy and get a lot of nice sun and warmth onto the roots, which bats are looking for some of these species. Again, thinking about dry roost spaces. So on the left, we have a nice cavity there that looks like a nice warm, dry place. On the right, we have a cavity facing the sky, which likely is going to be wet inside. So probably not ideal. Roost preferences actually vary among our different bat species. Some species like a lot of warmth and sun on their roost, such as the Indiana bat. So they tend to choose those trees that are either dominant in the canopy, like a shagbark hickory, or have died and all of their foliage has fallen off, and that lets some light in. So for that species, management may include releasing trees on some sides, just like you would for mass tree release. But in other cases, such as the northern long-eared bat, they're often in roosting suppressed in the canopy. So that means that they'll be down lower on the tree, often under closed canopy. So keeping a variety of different types of roosts in different situations in your forest is very helpful to manage for those different types of species, because they're all looking for slightly different things. Northern long-eared bats really prefer to have a very closed canopy, 60% or more. When we're thinking about why it's important to have a variety of different trees on the landscape, that is because bats engage in something called fission-fusion. I always picture this like a colony of bats, say 100 bats, is this giant amoeba. And the amoeba is not all moving at the same time. They're not moving from one tree to another and staying together. So that 100 bats might be just dispersed amongst these different roosts within their colony range, which include maybe 17 bats at one tree, 55 at another, 2 at another, 16 at another. And then they come together and go apart, just like the different legs of an amoeba. So here you can see a primary roost with red, and then you can see a bunch of secondary roost trees. But what we notice is when we think about bats traveling between those, we have to make sure that there's some connectivity. And having those openings can be a great thing, but we also want to think about where we place them and how many and how large openings we're creating all at one time, so that there's not a danger of removing all those known roosts to the bat. Proximity and diversity. So again, different bats using different elements of the forest for foraging, roosting, and commuting. So on the top here, we can see how in places like the Champlain Valley, where we have these agricultural areas, but then the connectivity with the hedgerows and leading to larger forest patches and little hillocks where these bats like to roost, and conserving those potential roost trees in groups so that you're leaving them not out in the open where it's dangerous for them to get to, but in closer proximity. So if you're thinking about where to place a group selection or a patch cut or do some thinning, you can look around, and if you see some snags or some trees with cavities and exfoliating bark, if you see natural areas where you have a congregation of those trees, that would be the area that would be better to retain. Maintaining travel corridors and the diversity of age classes, species, and forest structure will really help with a lot of different species. And now we're thinking again about that idea of harvesting to allow bats to adjust. So if you were to do a lot of very large patch cuts at one time, for example, if you did these areas, both these areas circled in yellow, you can see how that would remove, even if it's done in the wintertime when bats are not in the trees, that would remove nearly all of the trees that that colony already has selected and uses regularly to roost in. And what we know about bats is that they have high site fidelity. That means they come back to the same places year after year. And they may not use all the exact same trees, but they're definitely very loyal to a location and have been documented returning to the same exact roosts. So if you were to remove trees within one of those circles, bats would still have some of their roosts, maybe half of their roosts left, and they could adjust the next year. They would have some known roosts and they could find some new ones. But if you were to remove a lot all at one time, that's where we have the concern that it could be more difficult and stressful for bats to find alternate locations when they return. So the whole idea here is conservation through sustainability and this idea of intelligent and careful conservation. So we can both be out doing forest management on our land and also thinking about how to manage for these different bat species in a very compatible way. That's all I have.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. There's a few questions to start in the chat box, and I'm gonna throw it out to the rest of you that are listening. Go ahead and type your questions into the chat box that you might have about these amazing species. And let me start off with one that asked about their behavior. And they wanted to know, how unusual is it to see bats during the day? I saw one that looked like it was hunting over our pond at about 6 p.m. back in July. It hunted for about 10 minutes, then crawled up into the eaves of a shed.
That's a great observation. And I do get those, I don't know if I'd say regularly, but often enough. And most of the time, it seems to correspond either with a bat that perhaps has been disturbed, because we know that many people are doing work on their houses, and we have a few bat species that live in buildings, and they'll call me up to let me know that they just were pulling off some roofing or paneling to redo something on their home and disturbed a bunch of bats which flew out. So that bat might be displaced. It also is the case that if we have inclement weather, such as rain for a period of time, and bats don't have good luck foraging at night because they don't go out in that rain, or it's too cold, then they might take advantage of sometimes those early evening hours to come out. So it could be a sick bat, but there are a lot of explanations for it being a healthy bat that's just disturbed or is trying to get something to eat because they haven't been able to eat for many rainy nights.
Great, thanks. Another question, does the fungus, white nose syndrome, serve any good purpose? And if not, what are the techniques to eradicate it? Or, you know, where's the research with that part? You showed where it was distributed, but are there any treatments yet?
Yeah, so I liked that first question. Is there any benefit to it? So I think if you're a mycologist or someone who studied fungi, you would say, wow, what an incredible organism. It's so adaptable. It was accidentally introduced here from somewhere in Europe or Eastern Asia, where it's been found in many different countries in Europe and all the way over to Eastern China. You might think this is kind of a win for this fungus. It's really come in as this species that is really incredibly detrimental to bats, but incredibly, it doesn't need bats to survive. So what we found is in areas where all the bats died off and we actually closed the site off so bats could no longer get in during an experimental period, that the fungus is able to survive on its own because it's a soil-loving fungus. So it can survive in some of the other things inside a cave or mine, even with bats not there as a host. So if you like fungi, there might be some great benefits there, but it's not in any other way good for bats that we can tell. So the good news is there's a lot of great research going on into biocontrols for bats. So those would be natural fungi or bacteria that maybe live on bat skins or in the environment that already are shown to either suppress the growth of the fungus or kill it. And those are being tested out from some of the bats that we know are surviving well, like big brown bats, and then trying to see if we could apply those to little brown bats, either directly onto skin or through some spray in a cave or mine. But a lot of that's very difficult to do, and it'd be something we'd want to do on the leading edge where bats haven't died off yet before we see those 90% declines. There's even a vaccine that looks kind of promising in the works. But here, where we've had the fungus for a long time and most of the bats have died off, we're also seeing what could be some either resilience or in big brown bats resistance or just tolerance of the disease, where bats seem to be perhaps, in terms of little brown bats, undergoing some rapid natural selection, and they are surviving on their own. So it might be better in some cases for us not to interfere.
Sort of like finding beech nuts that are viable after the beech nut. And blue jays can help you find those, which is very interesting. We're moving to bat houses for a few questions. Is there a way to get bats out of the house and into their bat houses?
Yes, and I'm sorry I didn't spend as much time on that. Forest management's a pretty exciting thing to talk about, and I don't get as much of a chance as with bat houses, but yes. So one of the things is to make sure you have a really properly built and sited bat house. So thinking like a bat means that most of our species that use bat houses here really like 3/4 of an inch to an inch chamber width. So if you're looking for a bat house out there, you want to make sure that it's large. You're really looking for something that's about 2 feet high and almost 2 feet wide, and has usually multiple chambers that are 3/4 of an inch. Bats need a landing pad. So if you're going to mount a bat house, it's best to mount it on a structure. Honestly, they have the most success there. So maybe either a house or a barn or some other outbuilding. A second choice would be a post. They will use bat houses on posts. They just don't readily use them as well. Because they're not maintaining the temperature as well as if it's on the side of a building. You want to place it in a sunny area, and you want to place it up high. So bats need an area to drop out of the roost like a hang glider into flight. You're looking for the bottom of your bat house to be up 8 to 10 feet, and they don't do well if you place them on trees. Although we have a number of tree roosting species, bat houses do not tend to get occupied if you put them on trees. So those are some of the characteristics, and we have a lot of great information on our website and also at Bat Conservation International on exactly how to build a bat house, what design you should purchase, where to place them, and all those features that bats would like. And if you do need to get bats out of your house, I would say to do it in conjunction. Put the bat house up first, and then the next step is to line up usually a contractor, somebody who comes and knows really well how to find those holes that bats are getting in and out, which hopefully you've stood outside of your house at night and watched for them coming out at dusk so you know where they are, and to put in one-way doors so those bats get out but can't go back in. And that work is done in the spring and fall. And again, we have great guidance, best management practices on our website, or you can email me and I'll send you those.
So that sort of addresses the next question. They wanted to know if you could put a bat house up now, and is this a good time? So it sounds like it might be if you're trying to exclude them from your house at the same time.
Absolutely. Yep. You can put them up any time of year, but if you are going to be kicking a colony of bats out, it's best to put it up just before that, because they will be investigating their environment, and that gives them a chance to find their new alternate home before they lose the one they have.
So there was a comment that you made that there are, I think it was big browns that can winter inside houses during their hibernation or period of inactivity. And that's, so someone was like, you said bats stay in houses during the winter? Can you go into that a little bit more?
Yes, and although we have 2 species that are really well known to be, I think, to preferentially roost in buildings during the summer, little brown bats and big brown bats. Sometimes northern long-eared bats we've also tracked to buildings, not Indiana bats in Vermont, but in other states. And even occasionally eastern small-footed bats have been found to use structures, especially something like a slate roof, because they're a rock-loving species. But the only species we've found in structures in the winter are big brown bats. And we know that because, well, we get phone calls about them, and I've had them show up at my office in a shoebox in the middle of winter because someone was either up doing some re-insulation or renovation work up in their attic and a bat popped out, or what usually happens is we get a call when the weather changes dramatically. So when we have those days where the weather has changed about 40 degrees between day and night, or we have a big period of warmth where it's 50 degrees in the middle of December, those big swings mean that bats need to move. If they're hibernating underground in a cave or mine, the temperature stays stable. It'll be about 40 to 45 degrees in the middle of June and 44 to 45 degrees in the middle of January. Buildings don't do that. So when we have these temperature fluctuations, the temperature changes, and once the temperature gets above 50 degrees, bats can't maintain torpor, or that period of hibernation. So they tend to move looking for a cooler space. Once the temperature drops down well below freezing, they also can't stay there. So they tend to move. So that's when we'll get calls, because bats show up in people's living space in the middle of winter. Luckily, we have a rehabilitator, and it's called the Vermont Bat Center. His name is Barry Genslinger up in Milton, and he takes those bats in, and he's created essentially like a refrigerator out in his garage where he can maintain the temperature and humidity, and he lets those bats hibernate for the winter, and then he can release them back in that same neighborhood in the spring.
Very cool. There's a question, can you comment on any diseases that bats may have on humans? And I think maybe that means like transmit, or like, you know, people are frightened of bats getting in their hair, or they're gonna, you know, bite me and get me sick, or, you know, what thoughts are there on that?
Yeah, so what we would call zoonotic diseases, diseases that bats could transmit to people. So here in the United States, rabies is the primary concern. And although only on average 3 people die of rabies each year, it's deadly. And so we take it very seriously. So if you ever have any concerns, you would want to call the Vermont Rabies Hotline, 1-800, the number 4, and the word rabies, if you've ever had a bat in your house and you're not sure whether you've been in contact or not. So we take that very seriously. That's the major one, but it's very rare in the natural bat population. Probably less than 1% of bats are infected with rabies themselves, but it is fatal to them when they get infected as well. And let's see, histoplasmosis is the other one of concern. So if you have a large colony of bats and they're leaving droppings behind, whether that's in your attic or in a barn, you want to be careful about how you clean that up. So I would go to the Centers for Disease Control, CDC website, and look up histoplasmosis. It's a fungus that grows on bat droppings and bird droppings. It would be the same if you had pigeons or chickens. That fungus can grow on the guano, the droppings, and you want to be careful when you sweep that up an enclosed space, especially. Bats do have parasites, and it's possible that you could find what's called a bat bug. It's related to a bed bug, but it is not a bed bug. And they are host specific. They like bats. So when a colony of bats is in a structure, occasionally someone will find a bat bug that will show up, but they don't tend to stick around, and they don't tend to be very interested in humans. They're really pretty bat specific. But the one other disease we're concerned about right now is what we're worried about with reverse zoonosis, which is COVID. We're really concerned that this virus, SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19, can be transmitted to wildlife. And we have a number of examples where wildlife have contracted it from humans already. And there's research going on right now to find out if our bat species can get it from humans, because none of our bats in North America have ever seen this virus either. And there's a concern about introducing it to their population.
Interesting. What about the lifespan of a bat? And how long is the hibernation? And do they forage during that time at all?
Okay, lifespan. We do have records. I think 34 is the oldest bat that's been found in the area for a little brown bat. I think was found over in New York State by one of my colleagues. And that's from a recapture. We knew the bat was that old because it had a band on it that had been there that many years. But I know that some species can live up to 40 years old. So some pretty long living creatures for a creature this small. So the first one was how long do they hibernate?
Yep.
It depends on the species. Some species go into hibernation and on the sex and age of the bat as well. Some go into hibernation as early as September, October. Most are underground by November, hibernating by November. And then again, depending on the species, big brown bats might come out as early as March, but some of our other species really don't come out until about April 15th is kind of the benchmark time where they start to come out. And the males, because they don't need to come out and start their pregnancy, they tend to stay in longer. So sometimes they'll be hanging out underground until about June, maybe coming out once in a while during a warm spell to eat.
Will they forage during the hibernation period?
We don't see evidence of that for most of our species around here where it's really cold for little brown bats, northern long-eared bats. But if you move south, some of the southern states have been documenting activity in warm spells in the winter more than we do. Big brown bats are the exception here in Vermont. We definitely see them pop out, especially again, because they're disturbed when the temperature changes in the building. They do pop out and look for insects, but there's not, when we get those warm spells, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a lot of insect activity. And you have to think about that energy balance, the cost of flight versus getting a couple insects that might have hatched out. And for the most case, our bats just stay underground for the whole, almost 6 months.
Wow. So you talked a little bit about home range. There was a question about how far they fly from their roosts when they're foraging for insects.
It again depends on the species, and we don't have great information for some of these bats. For Indiana bats, we have the best information where we've literally tracked them all night as they forage around, and 2.5 to 3 miles is about the size of that home range, where the distance from where they're roosting or sleeping in the day, and if you draw a radius, a circle of about 2.5 to 3 miles is where all their foraging tends to happen. For some of the migratory tree bats that are much longer distance flyers, some of the work that's being done now includes what's called nano tags and these remote towers that are set up so you don't have to walk around in the woods with a handheld antenna looking for your bat. These towers will just get a ping when the bat flies by. And they've found that a red bat, for example, might fly a good 15 to 20 miles, just pop over here, another 15 miles over there in some of the coastal areas where that research has been done. So I think, again, it depends on the species.
Well, we're talking about foraging. There's a great question here. Is the decline in insects and pollinators overall impacting the pre-hibernation weight of bats? And does that make them more susceptible to white nose syndrome?
I wish I had the answer to that. Unfortunately, people usually ask me the reverse question. Is the decline in the bat population having an impact on insect populations is the question I normally get. And unfortunately, understanding how those two types of populations are tied together is fairly difficult. When I've had conversations with entomologists, they've suggested that there are so many things that cause variability in insect populations, such as a dry year or wet year, that it could be really difficult to draw a correlation between the decline in bat populations and insect populations. But I'm hoping that there might be better answers to that in the future. Right now, I'm not sure I could tell you what that relationship is.
Can you review and make suggestions for bats on current use plans relating to forestry, or is there someone that does that?
I would say the best place is usually to start with your county forester, but I'm working with Andrea Shortsleeve in our department to try to figure out how we can put some language in for wildlife habitat management, especially for the two federally listed species, the Indiana bat and northern long-eared bat. And that does include specific elements, especially if you have land where you have this species, either a maternity colony that's known or hibernacula. Those are the two areas that we're focusing on. And we do have a lot of known occurrences for those. In terms of general habitat management, there are a lot of great things that you can do that I'd be happy to talk to you about on your land. Whether you would be able to get those written into your forest management plan or not, I think has to do with the consulting forester who's writing your plan. I know that I just recently purchased my house and land and worked with the county forester and then a consulting forester. And just when they gave me language, they had a lot of great kind of standard language they put in for birds and for game species to manage, but they weren't as familiar with that. So I just spent a little time educating them on how we could add a few things in there that were compatible with the forest management plan, but it also focused on bats, such as maintaining some snags within the forested canopy.
Great. I'm going to throw two questions together because they have to do with winter and bats. The first was, what would cause a bat to be out in the winter during the day over the ice on Lake Champlain? And the other was, what happens if a bat colony is disturbed during winter by someone?
Yeah, so if you did have that observation, here in Vermont, although the disease really came through and we saw the biggest wipeout a number of years ago, it still hits bats every winter. So bats still go underground every winter. They're still getting infected with the fungus. They're still battling it. And we do still see bats emerging from the caves and mines in the middle of the winter. We typically see that behavior in January, February, and March. And those bats will just fly out onto the landscape in this kind of sick behavior. In some cases, they'll try to return to their summer roost in the middle of the winter. You'll see them on the roof or trying to go back to their summer roost. So that definitely could be white nose syndrome related behavior if you see that in the middle of winter. It also could be a bat that's displaced, which I think was your second question. So if you found a bat and it's a 15-degree day and one pops up in your living space, I've had people call and say, well, I found this bat and I let it back outside. I thought I should put it outside, but they put it outside onto the ground. Bats can't, most of them take off from the ground very well. And the bat probably was maybe not in a really active state and might have been only partly awake if they disturbed it in the attic, for example. And it takes bats a long time to arouse out of hibernation, 15 to 20 minutes to warm their body up. So it can't move around very well. And it's cold and snowy out there. So they'll say, I don't get it, the bat's flopping around on the ground or it's not moving. And they probably won't survive. So normally they would survive if you put them back outside, but in this case, that's a bat that should go to the rehabilitator.
So if they're going to go to the rehabilitator, do they contact the gentleman in Milton that you mentioned themselves? Do they contact the department, a game warden? How do they facilitate taking care of that bat?
I would say if it's a bat that no one's had any contact with, you see this bat outside on the ground, then you can go ahead and just call the Vermont Bat Center. If it's a bat you found inside your house, you don't know if one of your kids or your pets came into contact with the bat, then I would call the rabies hotline first and let them screen you to see if they have any concerns. Because as much as we care about these bats, it's much easier if there has been a potential exposure to rabies to get the bat tested. They do have to be euthanized for that, but it's much easier to get the bat tested than for you to go and get the prophylactic, the post-exposure shots for rabies and not really know whether you've been exposed. So we take the human health part seriously, and I would call the rabies hotline. If they don't have any concerns, then they would forward you on to the rehabilitator.
Yeah, speaking of that, we had someone who was bitten by a bat and they said they didn't kill it, so they had to have the rabies shots, and they said it wasn't very much fun. So,
well, and the big concern is sometimes people have to really battle with your insurance to get it covered, and paying for it out of pocket is very expensive. So I would just say be cautious there.
Great. There's some confusion about how the bats hibernate underground. What is that? What do you mean when they're underground?
Yeah, so they're literally going in the spaces that we know of, which are spaces that usually we can go down into caves or old abandoned mines. And once you get down under the earth, you tend to reach this really stable temperature. Just like if you were tapping into geothermal heat under the earth, that in these spaces that are deep into the earth, and some of them not even that deep, honestly. Some of them are spaces that a person can just fit through, maybe a space that's only about a couple people wide to get into. So it traps the air, in the air that's naturally a certain temperature, usually between 40 and 50 degrees right underground. And that air trap makes it so it's very stable in there for bats to stay over the winter.
Great, great. So just to clarify, they're not digging, they're using spaces that already exist.
Sorry, yes, they're opportunists. I always think of bats as opportunists. So they're looking for a space that already exists, whether it's their summer roosts or winter roosts. It's the same for your house. If you have bats that are living in your house, they are leaving behind smelly droppings and urine, which is the downside, but there's no digging, there's no chewing, there's no nesting. They're finding a hole that's already there. So I think of them as energy auditors. If you have bats in your house, you probably should be looking to see where your warm air is leaving in the winter, because that's what bats have found, is that region of airflow, a hole they can crawl through that either is there by design in the way your house was built, or maybe someone else has created, or an area of disrepair.
Great, great. Well, we have one more question. We have time for that, and then we'll wrap things up. And it's, who can help us determine if bats are present in our woods? Like if we're going to do some management, we want to know if they're there. What do we do?
I wish that it was a lot easier than that. You could look at some suspicious trees that you think bats would use and stand out there and stare at them at night, and you might see if some bats come out. The best way to figure out what species you have is either to capture them, which is pretty intensive effort that we don't do a lot of, or to detect them acoustically. And you can purchase a little microphone that plugs right into your smartphone, an iPhone or an Android, and you can listen for bats. And there's an automated species identification software that is a free app, but the microphone costs a couple $100. And you can use that to get a sense of what bats you have, what bats you hear out there. So you point it up in the air, and if there are bats flying around, it can identify species. The problem is that it's not always right, but it can get you in the general ballpark of a group of species at least.
Boy, that technology is amazing. That has really improved since the Anabats first came out back in the 92 or so, 96. So that's pretty cool. I didn't know that. Well, yeah, that's some exciting news.
If you're curious, you can look up the Echo Meter Touch. It's made by a company called, now I'm going to forget the company, but the Echo Meter Touch. Look up the Echo Meter Touch.
Okay, great. And someone quickly asked, what's the name of that smartphone app? Do you know?
It's probably the Echo Meter Touch app. Yeah.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, we have to use it with the microphone. And there are two versions of the microphone. One is less sensitive, and it's for kind of the general public, and it's maybe $200. And then the professional one is probably almost $400.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, Alyssa, this has been a great way to celebrate Bat Week, to learn about bats and what we can do on our own land to offer them opportunities and just to see what kind of threats there are for them. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the presentation. If you want to share it or watch it again, it will be up on our YouTube channel. You can also, if you're enjoying these programs, we're in the midst of our annual drive. Please consider a donation to Vermont Coverts. You can go to our website, www.vtcoverts.org, and make a donation there. And I wish everyone a happy Halloween. Enjoy getting outside, and everybody stay safe.
Happy Halloween. Happy Bat Week. Thank you so much.